Welcome to everybody to York History Group. My name is Kevin Freeman. Today is August 15th, 2021. And I hope you're enjoying the beautiful summer day, and perhaps you are watching this as it has been recorded and not live, but if you are live watching, welcome. Today we have with us, everybody knows James, or most everybody knows James, one of York's preeminent historians. And James is an amazing conversationalist, and I always love to talk to him. So I'm really delighted that he is joining us today. James reached out on York History Group, as most of you know, and a lot of people have responded to a new project that he is working on behalf of the First Parish Cemetery Committee, I believe. But James is going to lay out all the details of this. So why don't you go ahead and tell us all about it, James?
Sure. I've just within the past month, I've been chosen as a cemetery historian by the First Parish Cemetery. And the original intention, the cemetery board was hoping that I would help them, set up a tour of the cemetery. And as I was in the process of just working out some of the details for the tour, I realized what was really necessary was a registry of the individuals who were buried there, a sense of their biographies, of profiles, and so forth. So I began to explore how to approach that, and essentially have begun, systematically reviewing source materials at the town hall to determine town offices that were held by the individuals. It's a matter of properly establishing the identities of who is in the cemetery, and that's really been the first phase of this work, is just identifying who is there, making sure I have proper identifications based upon middle initials and that type of thing as I look through the town records and find town offices that are held. And it will be a continuing process of just going through multiple sources and finding out anything that I can about the individuals who are buried in the cemetery.
Yeah. So is that an echo? Yeah, what is that? So you're using primary sources to sort of connect to the graves, and then also you're looking to York History Group possibly to provide additional information on people's descendants that might be in the cemetery.
Yeah, I'm hoping either personal experiences that individuals have had. One of the things about this project is it has no time limit in terms of who is eligible to be included. So it will certainly begin with the inception of active use of the cemetery, and individuals were buried from the earliest period of the cemetery in the 19th century. But it will continue into the 20th century, and it will take advantage of the rich source materials that we have to make use of in terms of newspapers and photographs and all of those things.
So all this information will be compiled into a central database, which will be available for the public to see.
Yes, that would be the intention. The intention would be some kind of a database where individuals would, certainly be able, and a usable, easily usable type of a scheme would be the hope.
Yeah.
So that it, is as broad an application for people as possible.
So I think you have a lot of primary source information, and then how can, so if somebody says, oh, well, I have 3 generations buried there, all of my aunts and uncles are buried there, and most of my neighbors have been buried there, and I have information about them too. How does a person go about presenting all of that to you?
Well, I suppose we're in the process of working out those details. There'll be certainly the means for people to make submissions of information, and then I will need to, interrelate that material into the cemetery scheme. So I think that's what will eventually transpire. We'll just have to wait and see how that happens.
So for right now, do you want people to hold off on sending you stuff?
No, I mean, I'd be very open to learning as much as people can provide. I've now over the past week or so, the cemetery board, prepared a business card for me, and it has contact information on it. I'm happy if people want to send me information via email. I can certainly give my email address to people if that's what they would like to have as a source for contact.
Yeah.
And it's a continuing learning process. And each time that I contemplate how to consider this work, I'm thinking of the different types of sources I can make use of. Obviously, this is it's going to end up being quite a large project, but I think, as I do believe that it is practicable in terms of its design, and we will just have to see how it goes.
Okay, so would you like to share your email address with people so that they can start sending you stuff if they'd like to?
Sure. And as a priority, I'd really love to have information on the early 20th century, the individuals who are in the early 20th century, and then continuing right up until to the middle of the 20th century. But any information from that period of history. KencesJames@gmail.com.
Great.
So just reverse the name, KencesJames@gmail.com, and that can be a contact for people.
Yeah. Wonderful. And you said that currently you're working with a map of the cemetery.
Yes, the Angevin Gowan map from 1917. I was just over there just a few minutes ago. And so I took the map and transferred it into my notebook, into the different sections that are represented in the map. The difficulty is that in the 1917 map, the designations that are given for what are these avenues, these unpaved avenues that separate the different parts of the cemetery, they're given different names currently than they were in 1917. So they were only given number designations back in 1917. However, I was over in the section, basically what I'm going to do is systematically go through an entire walkthrough of the area that's included in the map, day after day after day, until I've completed the entire area. And then what I'm also noting is those graves that are not included in the 1917 map that have been installed in the period since the map was drafted in 1917. So that's another part of the process. If you take, ordinarily in the different grave sites that I looked at just this afternoon, there'll be perhaps 5 or 6 family members in that particular burial site. So while the map has 355 burial sites in it from 1917, the total number of burials is many times larger than what would be indicated by the 355 sites. So and they extend into relatively recent history within the past decades. So there's no way of regionally recognizing the evolution of the cemetery, except for the oldest portion, which from some of those internments, which would have been from the 1830s and 1840s, that undoubtedly was probably the earliest of the portions utilized in the cemetery. But it's hard to really establish the evolution of how the cemetery developed.
Yeah.
I should tell you, and this is very relevant to what we were talking about yesterday. I looked at the newspapers you sent to me, and I looked at just 3 newspapers, and I was astonished by how much information was in those newspapers of individuals who are in the cemetery. And just as a sample, I thought, I looked at advertisements, for example, and C.A. Roberts, contractor and builder, York Village. This would be Charles A. Roberts, 1887 to 1960. He is page 493 of in the vital records in the cemetery portion of the vital records. Charles A. Roberts, I was just over at that grave site just minutes ago. G. Frank Austin, undertaker, 1865 to 1937. E. E. Goodwin, contractor and builder, that's Everett E. Goodwin, 1902 to 1960. E. W. Baker, so Samuel A. Preble. Interestingly, at the very end of the very last page of the newspaper is a campaign, kind of a campaign piece by Samuel A. Preble for running for selectman. And it has this long sort of statement of his political position. But in addition to that statement is a photograph of Samuel A. Preble. So here's a case of where there are photographs of these individuals who are in the cemetery. This is a kind of interesting thing. This is from the newspaper. This is from 1906. Warren Toby sprained the ligaments in his leg Thursday evening while wrestling and will be laid up for a few days. Raymond Earl is taking his place with Hogan's Express. So both individuals are buried in the cemetery. There's this. These are all items of individuals who are buried in the cemetery. R.J. Levitt, James Holland will go to New Haven tomorrow to witness the Harvard-Yale football game. William Gifford, York Harbor, left Monday for a trip to California and expects to return several weeks seeing the country. E.C. Moody Jr. Will attend the Harvard-Yale game in New Haven. Roger Putnam attended the Harvard-Dartmouth game in Cambridge on Saturday, and then so forth. Little glimmers into these individuals that you can't get from any other source than a newspaper like that.
Yeah. So you're envisioning. I'm having. Are you hearing an echo on my end when I talk?
No, I'm not hearing an echo. No.
Okay, I'm hearing it. Yeah. So I'm envisioning that you're compiling almost like biographies on each person that's buried at the cemetery. So you'll go to the website that you're going to create, and there's going to be information. You'll click the name, you'll see the birth and death date, and then if there's any of these tidbits like you're finding in these old newspapers or people might provide to you or that you find from other sources, you'll include those in this database.
Yes, absolutely. You know, if I find a photograph of an individual or some image that is, you know, in some ways relates to those individuals and broadens some understanding of them, that I'd like to include that in this this database.
Yeah, so people that are members of York History Group, if they know their relative is in the cemetery for certain, it's okay for them to send a photograph of that person or any family member connected. How far away would it reach? Would it be just that person that you'd be interested in, or would it be like their parents if they weren't in the picture?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I think that the parents certainly, you know, the potential to include other family members is fine. It helps to broaden the relationships. And you know, just this afternoon what I'm trying to do right now is, and this is, you know, is necessary. It's going to be necessary. I'm going to each grave site that's in the 1917 map. I'm taking down, you know, all the information that pertains to the individual who was the specific subject of that grave site, and then including in that that examination, you know, the individuals who are also buried at the same gravesite, which will extend decades into the future. So then, if I'm going through town records or town reports or any source materials that would, you know, be relevant, if I encounter those names, I can readily associate them with, those persons. It's going to involve at this phase just multiple indexes, index upon index upon index,
Yeah.
so that I'm able to, properly identify individuals.
And it sounds like you're going to have the opportunity to also create family trees within this.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I
Yeah.
think so.
So if you have 3 or 4 generations on the database, you're going to be able to see whose son was whose, and whose parents were whose. And
yes,
yeah,
I agree with that. And hopefully the combining of, the different sources that I'm able to consult, tax valuation lists, the the town records in terms of town meeting appointments and selections and elections. If I'm able to include all of that, and then just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of source materials, I guess the best way to think about this is treating modern York in terms of the same level of scrutiny that you would for the early period in history, using all those types of available sources in order to build these profiles. And in the case of some of the ones I just mentioned, attending a football game in New Haven, or some of the other source materials that I was able to recover from newspapers, you get a glimmer into a personality that you wouldn't get from another source.
absolutely.
And you get a sense of friendship connections, because when B.J. Levitt and James Holland go together to visit the football game, you're getting a sense of the potential of the friendships that existed at the time as well. As I said, the whole purpose is not only to feature the individuals separately in terms of in their burial sites, but the intention also is to integrate them into, more broadly into other individuals in the community who they had some relationship with, not necessarily a familial relationship, friend relationship, or political partnership, or business partnership. All of that would be included as well. So you'd get this, this deeper sense of connection versus just looking at the separate sites individually.
Yeah. So James, this sounds very ambitious, and but you also are going to add something else to
Wait, in what way?
it, in that you're going to include the family cemeteries that are not.
Oh yes, yes. It's necessary at this point, when I'm doing the review of this material pertaining to the internments in the cemetery, that I also include the private plots. And again, the newspaper was valuable, because it described, this was actually quite interesting. This was the November 1906 paper. Joseph H. Shaw, who has been ill for several weeks, was taken to York Hospital last week, where he remained very low at this writing. And he died November 24th, 1906. And he's buried in the Nowell lot in Brixham. So when I'm doing this work on the cemetery, simultaneously, I'm also beginning to build some sense of who's buried in the private plots. And that will be a continuing effort
Wow,
to parallel what's going on with the cemetery project.
that sounds
I'm
like
going to know over time who is buried in those private plots, simply by just adding to the work that I'm doing with the cemetery.
that sounds like a lot of cross-referencing. Do you remember a lot of the names as you read them the first time, or do you actually go back and?
Well, that's why I always use notebook indexes, So I'll have a notebook, and so I'm going through the deaths right now, as I said, in the town hall. They fall into 3 categories. Those, of course, who were buried in the cemetery. Those, of course, who were buried in the private plots, or the neighborhood cemeteries. And the third category, which is one that also needs to be confronted, they're not in any record of where they're buried. They're just not in the vital records as to a place of burial. I'm recognizing that I'm making a list of all of those individuals I encounter, because they are York residents. And if they're not in those two possible locations, it may be reflective of a lack of what's in the vital records. In the course of doing this work, I've seen many reasons for making corrections and modifications to the vital records in terms of what I've encountered
Yeah.
in that source.
Yeah.
Names are incorrectly presented. Dates are incorrect. So I've been making those changes as I encounter these different sources. It has to be done. I think it's necessary because in many cases you'll find families in split between those portions of the family who are buried in the private plots
Right.
and those members of the family who are buried in the cemetery.
Yeah.
Often, within a generation of each other.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why there is an argument in defense of studying the private plots.
Yeah, my great grandfather was buried at the First Parish, and his wife was buried up on Clay Hill Road. And recently, when I was doing my genealogy, I discovered a death certificate for another wife that I didn't know that he had, but we think that it was just a mistake, a clerical error, and her name got written down as Moulton, but it was supposed to be Ramsdell. And the person that filled out the death certificate probably was just made an error. That's the easiest way to explain it.
Mm-hmm.
But but otherwise it's all you can do is speculate about it. James, so if a person wants to volunteer, can they do it at this level? Can they help you like directly with some of this information that you're sorting through, or is this going to be something you're just going to take on by yourself?
Oh, it'd be wonderful to build a group of individuals who would want to, assist, because there's such a broad amount of material that needs to be reviewed.
Yeah.
And the more energy that I have from individuals participating,
Yeah.
the better this is going to be, I think.
Yeah. So we have.
I mean, I don't want it to be I don't want it to be single-handed on my case. I'd like to think of it more as a a collaborative project where people that are actively interested would want to take part.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that so we have two ways currently. People can submit family memorabilia to you, and if they can take digitally, that would be great, I think. And what if they're not capable of digitally submitting that to you? Would you meet with them in person to receive some things that they might have?
Yeah, let's work out something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that you and I talked about this yesterday. We believe that there's a sleeping giant within the community of information, and I'm thinking this might really excite people to go into their closet or into their trunks and old boxes and photo albums and to look through them and see what that they can find with family members that have been.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. You see, and I found it really intriguing that there was so much in the newspapers. It was astonishing how much was in the newspapers. I mean, every page of the newspapers had something that was worth paying attention to. A dramatic performance at the town hall. So I looked at all the names and who were participating in that performance, and it reveals, little glimmers of insight into the personalities of these individuals in terms of what their interests were, what their talents were, and you want to bring as much of that forward. So the whole purpose here is to completely eliminate any sense of anonymity when you go into that cemetery and say, who is that who's buried there? Say, that person held that town office, that person did this, that person, as I pointed out just a few weeks ago when I talked to the cemetery office, you take a list of all the major institutions in this town, from the historical society to the York Hospital to the water company, the water district area. You find individuals who are directly related to those institutions in the cemetery, and these are the individuals who this town, owes its modern existence to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we talked a little bit yesterday too about the people that have the bigger memorials. I'm not sure if we spoke about this directly, but it was something maybe I was thinking. And the bigger memorials that get a bit more attention because they take up so much space in the cemetery. And then there
Hmm.
are the smaller stones of lesser people. And those people are also have, or I shouldn't say lesser people, but people that didn't have the same means. And we see from, like, when we're doing our own personal quest into history, that people with means did have better cameras to take better photographs, or they could hire portrait artists.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so a lot of these people have been left behind. But once we get into some of the more far-reaching areas of the cemetery and the family plots, there are a lot of families that were just kind of living a subsistence type of survival in town, and they didn't have a lot, but they still have a story. And that story starts really, if they're unknown, right there at that their resting place. And one example, James, that you're probably more familiar with than I am, is a fellow named Bragdon, who was a Civil War veteran and who died at Popper and is buried without a headstone in Cape Nettic. And I don't
Oh,
know his
yeah.
first name. Do you know him?
Um, I actually know something about the incident, but not a great deal of
Yeah, well,
information.
the reason I'm bringing him up because there was an adjacent cemetery that I was looking at years ago, and it was a Weber family cemetery, and there were beautiful headstones with really nice inscriptions. And then there was one right next to it that was gate. It did have a steel pipe and some stones in a perimeter, but there was no indication of a stone. There was just a veterans marker there, and I
Hmm.
thought, wow, what's going on here? And I found out that it was this Bragdon fellow, and he was injured, and I think it was Gettysburg, and he lived as a pauper in Ipswich, Massachusetts. He lived like on the streets. He had no money, and he died there. And somebody got him back up to York and had him buried in this anonymous type of a setting, which was very sad.
Yeah, it is sad, and you see what you encounter in the source materials is this enormous contrast, as you're sort of pointing out, into material resources of individuals in this town. Um, I mean, I'm encountering in the tax valuation books, real evidence of extreme poverty. Um, and you're looking at a town which, of course, was a tourist resort and had individuals who were really quite um, uh, prosperous, in contrast to these individuals who lived hand to mouth most of their lives.
Yeah, yeah,
And I think that I I, I certainly believe, just looking at the death records, and it's the death records. There's a kind of profound sadness about them because there's such high mortality, and the mortality of tuberculosis, even as late as the early 20th century, is killing off so many of the young people in town. These are people in their teens and 20s are dying of tuberculosis. Um, and of course, other individuals who are among those who are listed among the dead in the death records um, are just again reflective of high mortality from what are conditions that now would be certainly um, far more easy to treat and medically than they were at that time.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, it gives. I hope the purpose of this is to give an accurate portrait of the town and to be as comprehensive and as inclusive so that no no arbitrary limits are imposed upon who is allowed to be profiled. And I'd love for there to be full gender balance and all of those aspects so that I'm as interested in finding out about the profiles of women, of course, as men. Men, certainly in the late 19th century, may be prominent in terms of the sources that are available. But one of the reasons that I think the family reminiscences and just the personal family experiences will be of advantage here is that they will be a balance between both men and women who are represented.
Great. Yeah, so is it okay to post your email address with this video when this video is put up on Facebook?
Yeah, I still would like to talk with Todd Frederick. The two
Okay.
things I'd like to do now is I'd like to have a talk with Todd Frederick and also about how to set this up as an online design.
Okay.
You had the conversation we had yesterday about suggestions about setting this up, I think are, especially important at this point in time.
Yeah, I think the earlier you get started on having some sort of a formal database, the easier it will be to fill it in. If you once you collect all this data yourself in handwritten notes, and then you try to put that into the database, it becomes a very big process, especially on the scale of this project, James.
Well, let's look at it this way. Let's just see. Let's not just be at such a high level of expectation that it becomes overwhelming.
Okay.
Let's just get this started.
Yeah.
Let's just add to it, by increments, and see how it works, and just expand on it, expand on it, expand on it,
Okay.
and see how it works. And the the recommendations and suggestions people can make about what can be done to improve upon this, I'm certainly receptive, and will take everything in that's suggested.
Okay. I think that sounds excellent. And for those who are wondering, there are some newspapers that were scanned and are on the internet that I put there from a collection of Jakey Raymond Ware. From they started in the 1890s and ended there. They kind of went up to the 1920s or just before the 1920s, and then they resumed after that in the 1930s. And I have a stack about 5 or 6 inches tall, and I have been digitizing them, and I've put the partial images on a page, and I will share that link with everybody too. And James, I just want to say it's amazing, you as a historian, when you see those newspapers compared to someone such as myself, you have such a different takeaway. And I do find some of the tidbits kind of amusing and humorous. And I don't know a lot of the people that were like, in the obituaries. I might know some of them, but you seem to have a much more of a connection to them all. So it has a greater meaning to you, I feel like, and I'm so grateful that that we just happened serendipitously to mention that yesterday, and here you are perusing through them already and culling them out.
Yeah, the advertisements, the little bits of information that are often mentioned in little fragments of information, all of that is really valuable. And there's the fraternal organizations, who the officers of the fraternal organizations are. All 6 of these fraternal organizations from 1895 are individuals who are buried in the cemetery. That's another aspect, because first of all, it reveals who these individuals were in terms of their involvement with those organizations, but it also involves an aspect of interrelationship of other people who belong to those organizations. So, as I said, really think of this as not so much looking at the individuals within the burial sites, but how those individuals relate to other individuals in the community in as many ways as possible. Business partnerships, friendships, political rivalries, anything that will provide some insight into how these people functioned within the community during the time of their lives.
Yeah, and I know York History Group we're really interested in building a community of like-minded people, and based on history. And I think that this just really expands on it. And so I'm really glad that you've reached out to us and asked us if we can assist you. And I know that we're going to have more conversations with you, and we're going to find out how to really hone in ourselves and assist you in the most best way that we can. So I think,
Yeah, I can assure you, it would really be great if a group of individuals wanted to, assist as volunteers and really move this forward in a big way.
yep, okay. All right, so I think that that is a wrap, and I hope everybody goes back outside and resumes enjoying this beautiful summer
Yeah,
day. And, and I
yeah.
want and I want to thank James Kences. James, thank you for taking this big project on. It's amazing, and it seems to be really exciting, and I look forward to seeing how this develops.
Okay,
All right,
okay,
all right, everybody, have a great day, and we'll catch you next time.
okay, okay. Thanks, thanks.
We're still here, but we're not on Facebook.
Okay.
Are you going? Are you still a member at Old York?
Well, I haven't received a renewal notice. I back in 2020, I spent the stimulus check on $1,000 membership. So I haven't heard from a renewal notice yet. Why?
Oh, because the annual meeting is coming up at 4
Oh,
o'clock today.
okay. I wish I could find within the Old York Historical Society, an appreciation for why this is important, um, and how it is really an extension of how a town history should be approached, I think.
You mean this particular project?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it would be appropriate to have a conversation with Joel on this. Yeah, because it's because their resources are tremendous.
Oh, there are. I mean, the photographic resources,
Yeah, yeah.
the different letters and diaries that are there. Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And also, I think that if we can, if we paint this as a picture of all these people contributing their resources and volunteer efforts, it makes a great story because it's, the whole town is like, could really kind of grasp this and participate.
Well, as I said, I mean, the founders of the Old York Historical Society, in terms of its earliest incarnation, are buried in the cemetery. So that I one of the thoughts I've had, and I wish that there would be a way to explore this with Todd Frederick, is where all the founders of the York Hospital are buried. I think there should be a little marker, founder of the York Hospital,
Hmm.
Dr. J. Hazen,
Yeah,
Ralph Hawks. Why
yeah,
shouldn't there be, something like that? And you see, once you get those institutions connected to the cemetery, with their being aware of the fact
yeah,
that there is a relevance
yeah,
to the cemetery in terms of to their organization.
yeah. I think
Perhaps
you're
you
building
build upon
pride.
that.
Yeah, I think you're building pride when you do that amongst the organization and the families.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
you you want to draw upon the pride that families have in their ancestors. You want to broaden that pride so that the larger community is aware of that as well.
yeah,
Um, Rather than simply, this is really what I've been trying to do over the past so many years, is I've been taking individuals who have become obscure because the modern um, society has no longer any kind of a sense of who they were, and tried to point out the role they played and why they were important
yeah,
to make them relevant.
yeah,
And I think for me personally, what has been so beneficial is that every time I go to the cemetery, like I did today, um, I'll get a stronger sense of connection with names that are no longer just names. It's
right.
it's incremental.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not automatic, but
It's a
I'll get a
process.
new insight into a person who I've encountered in the records, and I go, oh my God, I now know who that person is, and
Yeah,
what that person did in their life, and so forth. And so each visit seems to result in that kind of a experience.
yeah, and I think is what you're doing by taking this project on is you're making all your research accessible to people. So someone such as myself can just go and search this database or take a tour with you, and you've done all the legwork for me. It's like I don't have to do anything except for just listen to you or read what you've just written. And that's a big gift to the community, James. I think that it's that has a lot of merit. So that's great.
Well, as I said yesterday, to me, the most important, it's really critical that if you want to assume, the role as town historian, that you don't create some kind of a cutoff for what is important for your study and what you're not going to regard as important to your study. The challenge as you move into modern history is that the sources become, on such a scale that it's hard, um, to approach them as you would with the early materials. The further back you go in history,
Yeah,
smaller amount of source materials that you need to consult.
yeah,
The
yeah,
forward, as you go forward in time, it just becomes, somewhat intimidating in terms of all
yeah,
the material you have to look at. You know how much, just one newspaper, it takes over an hour to properly look at one of these newspapers because there's so many little details in the pages.
yes,
You
yeah,
have to read every one of them over,
yeah,
and you know you just have to assume that any possible item that you encounter is really important, and you don't want to exclude anything.
yeah. And some of those ones that I think they're the transcript. They started to maybe be a franchise of a big national paper. And so then they would start including like political essays by like people that would be obscure to me. And they'll go on for like a whole page
Hmm.
on like maybe just something on the Statue of Liberty and, and it just, but it's very, to me, it's obscure because it's not anything that's immediately, it doesn't set off any green lights in my head. It's just like, oh, but it's not, and it's not of local interest. So then I've skipped over some of those. But when I photograph them, I do include those in with the paper. I want to do them all in their entirety. And the other thing is, once I get done with these, or if you'd like to browse through them, some of them are in really bad shape, and I have some that are, I think, the New Hampshire Gazette, and they're actually disintegrating, and they were from maybe the 1850s, and they're in little folders that I don't even like to open up and look at because I know that
Mm-hmm.
each time I do, there's going to be another layer of disintegration that happens. But maybe you would like to look at, maybe I could get those to you. I don't think they're even worthy. And also just to let you know that supposedly Old York Historical Society did have these digitized and they're on microfilm over there.
Yes, I've used the microfilm of the newspapers.
Okay.
I have used them. I was at one point, making my regular visits over to the Historical Society Library,
Yeah.
and the problem was that, as I said, uh, and perhaps it was in large part because I had an entirely different focus of attention at that time. Um, right now, the exciting part is that so many of these just ordinary names that in newspapers that you encountered in the past didn't ring a bell suddenly do ring a bell.
Oh, yeah.
And so that you find,
Yeah.
virtually every time you look at a newspaper, there's material in it. There's not
Wow.
a moment with those newspapers where there's not material
Wow.
that's really of interest. It's little details perhaps of their
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah.
And in some ways, the only way it becomes important is when you take their in their totality. But they are little glimmers. As I said, look, the men who attend the football games.
Yeah.
Well, that's something important.
It really is, and the um, transcription of the Bragdon Diary that Pat Fitzgerald did, he just says one day it's like it's the hottest day of the summer, and I'm hoeing potatoes or tomatoes, and that was it. That was all he wrote. But that was so significant that he wrote that. You could really feel that it was the hottest day of the summer. Yeah.
Well, and I was telling people, and I told Todd Frederick, and I've told others that there is this area in the cemetery just within this small little area where these different diarists are all buried. Harriet Emerson, Samuel W. Junkins, Captain Thomas Clark. Um, they're all buried within this small Joseph Bragdon. one of the thoughts about, the volunteers and the role the volunteers could play is I'd really need some people to go to the Historical Society to read the Joseph Bragdon diaries. These little diaries are little diaries like this. They're not
Yeah.
very big,
Yeah.
and they're all written in pencil.
Yeah.
And he was one of the most important political personalities of the last quarter of the 19th century. He's
Yeah.
just very important.
Yeah.
And his diary is just filled with all kinds of information. I mean, to think of what is in those diaries and how it would be relevant to understanding, the individuals who are buried in the cemetery is just really something to consider. The same thing with Samuel W. Junkin's diary, which is, from really the last part of the 19th century to the first part of the 20th century, the first decades of the 20th century. That's another very rich source because Samuel W. Junkins is just such an active social political figure in town, and he mentions everything that's going on.
Did you say
So
Junkins?
Samuel W. Junkins, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. 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 Oh, so I didn't know they had that there too. Okay.
So they have that historical society.
Oh.
And the frustrating part is nobody ever looks at these diaries. Nobody ever looks at these diaries.
Yeah.
I wrote, a newspaper essay a few years ago on Joseph Bragdon, and this was when Garfield was assassinated. So Joseph Bragdon, describes in his personal experiences his reaction to the assassination of Garfield.
Hmm.
And so this is all in his diary, and
Yeah.
he talks about town politics, and he talks about all of these things, and then he mentions the individuals that he has. If I made a pledge back at the time of my protest where I was never going to go and use the materials in Kittery. And I felt I had to do that because it was the only way to just persuade individuals. I had no ulterior motive when I engaged in the protest of why I was out on the street. But of course, it's become somewhat of self-defeating now because what I would really need to be doing right now is being an opportunity to go over to Kittery and just review what is there. It's very painful to think of all the items that I would encounter in Kittery that I'd be able to utilize really constructively. Look at just town directories,
Yeah.
in terms
Yeah.
of all the
So
individuals in
James,
town directories.
is there anything preventing you other than transportation from getting to the archives?
It's the pledge that I made.
Is the what?
It's the pledge that I made that I would never visit the Kittery
Oh,
archives.
you can walk that back.
Well, the only reason I felt that I'd have members of the Junkins family come up to me and they'd say that how terrible it was, the things had been taken to Kittery and all of that, and I said, yes, I understand. I'm hoping, I'm doing what I can to encourage the archives being brought back to town.
Yeah, but you're still welcome to use the archives, and if you swallow a little bit of humble pride, you'll be I think you'll be all the better for it. I'm an advocate for you using the archives because you're such a tremendous historian, and that's a shame that you feel that
Well, I guarantee you, with what I know about who's in the cemetery now, every time I would go to the archives, I'd find all kinds of new material.
Yeah.
I mean, if
Yeah.
just a chance to read
Yeah.
Joseph Bragdon's diary, I'd be amazed
Yeah.
how much material I'd find in Joseph Bragdon's diary. Really.
Yeah, I hear you. I know. Yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to keep that in mind because I want you to feel welcome over there. And I'm gonna slip away because I'm gonna go to that annual meeting, which is at 4, and I gotta log in.
Oh, sure.
Did you get an email for that?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. And it's all right. I've got some other work to do this afternoon. So.
Okay. All right, and Elaine just messaged me, and she said that she's worried that you might not be able to have enough support, and she wants to help us to make sure that we rally up the history group to provide you ample support. So I think you've struck a really good chord, and I think that I just have a feeling that you've energized people And I'm really psyched that we're going to go with this. So
I'll put it this way. I think it could be a lot of fun.
yeah. Oh yeah. That's what. Yeah. Totally. Totally.
I think it'd be a lot of fun to just take all these individuals who have been lost to history and to bring them back into an active role.
Yeah. And I know that Kevin McKinney, Elaine Wood, myself, we were talking yesterday, and we're looking forward to having a meeting with you at the First Parish Cemetery with Todd. And so that you guys can, for maybe next week or the week after, so you'll be able to further hone what we can do more concisely to be proactive in this.
Well, and the idea of the database, that's really the priority, is the database, setting that up.
Okay, all right, and I might, and is it okay if I share your contact info with Elaine, because she does databases, and I think she.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank
Okay.
you, James. All right.
Yep. You have a nice
Have a great day.
afternoon. Yep.
Okay, bye.
Bye.